Welcome to the Inside Story. I'm Billy Hallowell, and I'm joined today by the Christian Post's Brandon Showalter. How you doing, Brandon?
I'm doing well, Billy.
Well, we've got a lot to break down today. This massive Supreme Court victory. It's a victory, certainly, from the perspective of Christians and many conservatives who have been watching this case closely. And this is a case surrounding Tennessee and a law that essentially was banning body mutilating surgeries and hormone drugs for trans-identified minors. Take us through. We'll just start from a 30,000-foot view. What did the Supreme Court find in this case?
The Supreme Court found, basically what they allowed is for Tennessee's law prohibiting the transing of children medically to stand. And they found that the state of Tennessee did not violate the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause. And in their ruling, they determined that, quote unquote, transgender status did not constitute a discrete category of people based on an immutable trait. And so, when the 14th Amendment question, when equal protection is at issue, it has to rise to the level of strict scrutiny, where if you've got a group of people being discriminated against, it has to be on the basis of something concrete like sex or race. And they found that, quote unquote, transgender status doesn't exactly rise to that criteria. And so it was an interesting way to address the subject of so-called gender-affirming care, the administration of hormone blockers to halt puberty, cross-sex hormones, and surgery, even though the plaintiffs in this case were only about the chemical aspect of this. No one was surgical, but the ruling itself applied to the entire Tennessee law, which prohibited both hormonal and surgical transing of minors. And so this was an equal protection case. And so it was an interesting way to go at this. But the implications of this ruling are going to be quite far reaching given the ideological issues that came through in the substance of the ruling authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, with some compelling and strong concurrences from the other conservative justices. Of course, it was 6-3, and the leftist justices on the bench predictably dissented, though Elena Kagan did not join the Sotomayor lead dissent in full. So that was interesting as well.
All right, so you have been working on this issue for a very long time. You have the Indoctrination Podcast with Christian Post here. You have covered this more than anyone, and I always say that because it is true. It's absolutely insane how much work you've done on this. You just said this is a big deal. Help us really understand why you think this is a transformative ruling, one that really could help turn the tides on this issue.
Well, a Supreme Court ruling has national implications. And so you've got a federal top at the highest level court saying that there's no there, essentially, that the amorphous concept of gender identity, which is completely detached from reality, can't be used. It's a sort of a major blow against the ideology at large. And so that has significant implications. And even in, I believe, Justice Amy Coney Barrett's concurring opinion, she wrote about other issues that this will no doubt implicate, like women's sports and privacy, bathrooms, that kind of thing. These policies, these regulatory policies, this will have implications for them. And so even though the case centered on medical treatments, if you even want to call them that, I don't like to call them that, but this was the issue at hand. Um, when you're defining people based on an inherently flawed concept, that's, you just can't get around other issues where this is going to have relevance and bearing. And so that's going to be a big implication. I will be interesting to see going forward how the opposition, trans activists and their allies, tackle gender issues as these other cases percolate up through the court system, and what lower courts and appellate courts do now that we have this high court ruling. They'll have that to draw upon. So this will have ripple effects throughout all other areas of policy. And it will be interesting to see how it's applied, because what happened with the Bostock ruling, and this was the only other case at the Supreme Court that I know of where transgenderism was in play, and that was an employment case in 2020. It was actually 6-3, with two of the conservative justices joining the four liberals that was the composition of the court at the time, where they ruled that you can't be gay or trans and be fired on that basis because that constituted sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. They didn't touch that case in this Skermeti ruling yesterday, but the Biden administration used the Bostock ruling from 5 years ago to justify all kinds of things transgender related, even though the court was very specific that this was to be narrowly held and confined to the employment context. But the Skermeti ruling, I think, is is broadly worded enough where if there's an equal protection issue or another claim, that people will rightly be able to point to this high court ruling and say, yeah, this applies here. And so it's a major blow against transgender ideology in a larger context. And we're already seeing sort of postmortems. In the New York Times has something today about how this is a strategic bet amongst the ACLU and LGBTQ activists that suffered a major loss yesterday. So we're still waiting for the dust to settle, of course, but it was a good day for those of us who have been trying our very best to expose this medical scandal and child abuse for what it is.
Yeah, I think that the core of this that often gets lost in the discussion is if an adult, and look, there are conversations to be had here in debates and ethics discussions, but the point is if an adult makes a decision to go through these, quote unquote gender affirming care, if they make that decision, they're of age and able to do that. If a child is making that decision, children, there are all sorts of things children cannot do and cannot be trusted to make decisions on because their brains are not fully developed. Why in the world and how in the world do we get to a place where we are suddenly on this very serious life altering, body altering, drug induced issue acting as though children's feelings are the arbiters of all truth? How did we get to this place where this even needed to be a Supreme Court battle?
It's such a good question. And we could probably talk for hours about the devolution of why we defer to children at all. How did we lose the adults in the room? How did this become a thing where we're actually spouting the insanities that children can even give consent to medical treatments? And that was actually something, interestingly enough, that Justice Clarence Thomas wrote in his concurring opinion, that we know that minors, based on their cognitive development, should not give consent to this kind of thing. Um, I really think that, I mean, there's just no question on a large scale that culture at large has forsaken God's righteous ways, and with that, there has been an indisputable breakdown in morality and ethics. And one of the things that it sort of sticks in my memory when I was interviewing Abigail Schreier 5 years ago. And for those who don't know, she wrote the watershed book, Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, which in my mind, really, I say it's watershed because it flipped the script on this issue. She sort of captured the moment and stole the narrative from the trans activists, where uh, she actually called attention to a real problem and got a lot of people on the left to care. And so it sort of disrupted the narrative around these issues. What she told me 5 years ago, when I asked her if the loss of robust practice of religion in our society contributed to the breakdown in medical ethics, what she said was that she thinks that if you have robust religion in society, and in our case it's usually some form of Christianity, but she's Jewish, and so same root. When you lose that, you also lose the kind of herd immunity from moral stupidity that religion confers upon society. And I think we have lost that as a society. And so now we see, since we've lost that herd immunity to moral stupidity, we see insanities like children claiming to be the other sex and doctors in their white coats with their degrees on the wall thinking that we should allow children to do that, and will then claim that they will kill themselves if they don't, and use the law to coerce parents into going along with it. I mean, the breakdown is massive, and it is hard to believe that we have gotten to this point at all. I can scarcely believe, Billy, that I've spent the last 9 years calling attention to something so bizarre and terrible. But it does seem that the natural law finds a way, that sanity does have a way of returning when things get so extreme that even people who aren't religiously observant, see this for what it is. And if there's been a silver lining in any of my journalistic work here at the Christian Post, is that I've heard from tons of parents and other people who are not remotely Christian, but they don't want their children to wind up sterile. That's a very primal human thing. So I am encouraged that even though the breakdown has been severe, uh, sanity does have a way of backlashing, if that's even a word. There is hope to be found, and I'm hopeful, especially in light of the ruling yesterday, that given how this is such a mark on the wall, that maybe we will see further developments legally and culturally. Um, and I know we've talked about this, but the Federal Trade Commission is going to be putting on an event here in a few weeks where I'll actually be a speaker along with some others who are going to be showing these medical treatments to be consumer fraud and unjust trade practices. And so, uh, hope springs eternal. There are some really positive signs on the horizon, and the federal government is currently, not just the Supreme Court, currently using its leverage and weight to call this medical scandal what it is, and I'm deeply encouraged by that.
You also have your show, Generation Indoctrination, coming back very soon. I'd love for you to tease a little bit about what people are going to hear on the show, because you really are diving deep into these issues, helping people understand the intricacies and the impact that this has had on people, families, and communities.
Yes, we are currently in the process of producing. I'm finalizing some episodes, and we're hoping to roll them out soon for season 5 of Generation Indoctrination, our documentary podcast here. And there were a couple things that we wanted to explore. I was wondering if, season 4 might be the final season, but we felt like we had to at least acknowledge, in light of President Trump's reelection and the undeniable cultural change that has happened as a result of that alone, that was worth exploring and analyzing. And there's still a lot of pieces to pick up. That's kind of the larger theme of this season. It's like, where do we go from here now that there has been an undeniable change? As some people may remember, the blueprint Democratic polling analysis, the postmortem of the election, showed that in the swing states, Kamala Harris's support for transgender issues was the biggest loser for her of any issue, by 28 points in those swing states. And so that was an election loser. But where do we go from here, in light of the wins? The fact that President Trump was able to use the issue and you know go across the finish line with it. What does that mean in light of all of these federal changes? I also give attention to the state of Alabama. I know Tennessee's law was the one that won at the Supreme Court yesterday, but it can't be denied that the state of Alabama played an outsized role in helping that come to pass. And so I interviewed the Attorney General of Alabama and some other officials in that state who were a part of this fight. And we're also talking to some families again, because I think, frankly, the fallout from this horrific medical scandal and cultural social push of trans ideology will be felt for decades, sadly. This shattered so many families and ruined so many lives. I have no doubt that books are going to be written about this very troubled and dark time in history when the world went insane, believing this lie that it's possible to be born in the wrong body and using medicine and surgery to accomplish those ends. So I, at the very least, we do appear to be we appear to have some real momentum in a positive direction, but we are still by no means out of the woods yet. And so there are more angles to explore. There's more angles to cover. There's more journalism to do. So season 5 will accomplish that, I hope.
Well, Brandon, I so appreciate you taking the time breaking down this Supreme Court case and this issue as always. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Billy.
Everyone else, make sure you tune in next week for another episode of The Inside Story. And in the meantime, head on over to the Christian Post. We'll see you next week.